Our guest today, a noted author. He has written biographies on the likes of superstar Billy Graham, Ric Flair, Classy Freddie Blassie, as well as covering the independent wrestling boom of the past decade, as well as wrestling during the COVID era. His latest book covers WrestleMania III, which is what we are going to be discussing today with Bigger, Better, Badder. WrestleMania III and the year that changed everything. Keith Elliot Greenberg joining us here at Post Wrestling. Keith, congratulations on the book, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you about it.
Good. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me on again. Every time I write a book, you always invite me on, and I have a lot of gratitude for that.
Well, tell me a little bit about just. I found it to be a really interesting process of the way you tackled this because, yes, it is in some ways this singular event from 1987, but it had such ramifications in the years leading up during the national expansion and across the board. Like, this really is this culmination of Vince McMahon's expansion and the impact on all the other territories. And the title says itself, the event that changed everything. So, I mean, it must have been a daunting task that you're really doing like the history of a lot of these territories and the ripple effect that Vince McMahon's expansion is having on these companies that leads to this seismic event.
Yeah, and as a storyteller, I always want to consider a lot of angles. Like, if I'm more, I also uh, cover non-wrestling related stories, and I've done a lot of true crime. And sometimes I'll cover a true crime story, and 20 years later, I'll think, well, remember that little kid whose mother was the victim? Like, where's that kid today? Is that kid in law enforcement? Is that kid a victim's advocate? Is that kid a criminal? So I feel that it was important to examine the people in the territories and what it felt like to be playing on the losing team when WWE was just expanding in ways that were unprecedented.
A lot of this circles back to the first WrestleMania in 1985. And I know we've spoken in the past. That was an event that you attended. And that day leaving the arena, was there this acknowledgement that the game has changed? Or was this still something that was, we don't know what the effect of this show is going to be vis-a-vis the industry in the US?
Sure. I mean, look, the first Starcade had taken place 2 years before. Starcade, I don't know if we thought of it as an institution. It was something that was, going to be done every year until people tired of it. I mean, I, recently wrote an article for Inside the Ropes magazine about the super shows that preceded WrestleMania. And even you look at in World Class, or in Texas, or the Dallas Promotions Parade of Champions, that had begun in 1961. But there were years when there wasn't a Parade of Champions. It wasn't an annual event. 84, was that critical one where Kerry Von Erich won the title, and those continued for a couple of years until World Class flamed out. But I mean, I don't think anyone envisioned that we would now be getting ready for WrestleMania 41, that there would be a 41-year legacy. Um, I quote my friend and mentor Ed Raschuti in the book, who was the editor of the WWF magazine. And when I met him at WrestleMania 1, he said, probably 2 more years. 1 year to go up, 1 year to go down. It's a fad. Nobody thought it was an institution. WrestleMania 3 established WrestleMania as an institution. And I make this point in the book, not just WrestleMania, but everything that surrounds WrestleMania. I mean, I'm going out to WrestleMania next week in Las Vegas, and I'm going to be with people who are coming from Europe, and some of them don't even go to WrestleMania anymore. They go to indie shows, they go to comedy shows, they go to documentary shows. I'm signing books at a puppet show at the Vegas Repertory Theater called Kayfabe, and I saw that their show in New York at one point. A puppet, a marionette, did a dive from the balcony onto somebody. So this is way beyond a couple of guys taking bumps in a ring. And WrestleMania III created the environment for that, where now it is an acceptable pilgrimage. You can say to your boss at work, I'm taking my vacation, I'm going to WrestleMania, and they don't go, what is wrong with you? Are you insane? You know that stuff is fake, right? That changed.
Just going back again to the first WrestleMania, being in New York, can you kind of convey what the media blitz was like in that final week in the lead up to the show, and just
The first Mania.
For the first WrestleMania, and the
There was
fact
a
that it
lot
was
of
staged
media.
in New York as well, being very critical
That
to
was
its success.
intentional. And that was why WWE organically already had the advantage. They were also the largest territory. They went from Bangor, Maine, all the way down to Washington, D.C. There was no large, I mean, well, you could argue that Vern Gagne had a larger territory because they flew everywhere, the American Wrestling Association. But it wasn't consistent all the way spread out. Like they flew to Denver, but I'm not so sure there were pockets between, say, Minneapolis and Denver that were solidly AWA. In the Northeast, which is quite congested, you had everyone from Bangor, Maine to Washington, D.C. was under the WWF umbrella. So that was already the edge. You also had New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, really big cities. And Cowboy Bill Watts says that in the book. He had the territory. His biggest city was probably New Orleans. They were also working with the Houston promotion, but there was nothing compared to what the McMahon family had. And so it is a media center. And I knew that. I was a freelance writer at the time. I started very young as a freelance writer. I was 19 years old. By the time WrestleMania 1 happened, I was 26 years old, and I was freelancing. And I knew that any major figure in the world was going to come through New York. So I could pitch a sports story because every sports team you pass through New York. I could do a celebrity story, even though Hollywood was where the celebrities might have lived. They all came to New York for promotional reasons or to work on a project. I could pitch a political story. Politicians came to New York to raise money. And so that was an advantage that Jim Crockett Jr. did not have in Charlotte or Atlanta. That Fritz von Erich did not have even in Dallas. And by 1985, Mike LaBelle's Los Angeles promotion had gone under, and Vince ran that. So he had New York and Los Angeles. Those were the two capitals of media attention. So yes, there was a ton of attention, and it wasn't attention just on, the local news. It was national media. And so there was a buildup, and everybody in the city, and I would think in much of the country, was aware that something very big was happening. I mean, Mr. T and Hulk Hogan were the guest hosts on Saturday Night Live the night before WrestleMania. A lot of people were disgusted by that in the business. It's like, wait a second, they're supposed to be in this big match and they're hosting a comedy show? And those fans, Vince was willing to let them drift away because of all the new fans he was getting.
Yeah, it is quite remarkable too if you go back to watch that episode, and not just their appearances, but they got to like fully promote WrestleMania throughout like many mentions on the broadcast. Like that's not an insignificant aspect to like that last minute push for, just showing up for the closed circuit viewings the next day.
Yeah, I mean 90 minutes on the NBC television network, and people don't understand how rare that was. Professional wrestling was not part of the mainstream. The NBC national network did not do stories about professional wrestling until Vince started the expansion. So, if I remember, I used to save newspapers and magazine articles that would mention professional wrestling. And I'd look at them sometimes like, wow, Bruno Sammartino's name was mentioned in the National Enquirer, the National Star. You know, it was such a novelty because it was considered such fringe entertainment.
Did you feel that that was a bit of a handicap for some of the promoters, that inability to see the forest from the trees, and you see that reaction of a Saturday Night Live opportunity, for instance, and it's looking at that as some kind of negative instead of like the broader picture here, that was going to hurt some promoters if they had that mindset.
And they did have that mindset. You know, they were afraid of the media. Vince McMahon's father, was afraid of too much media attention. I mean, and it comes out in the book that, you know, Ed Holinsky, who ended up working as the original editor of what became the WWF magazine and then headed merchandising, he was a newspaper reporter. He wanted to do a story on a WWF show in upstate New York. And he was told, this is, you know, before the WrestleMania era, yeah, we're not interested in getting mainstream attention, because mainstream attention would inevitably lead to the question, the big secret being revealed. Like, oh, they were just going through the motions. Oh, they're actors, not athletes. Now, that isn't true. They are athletes. They're great performers, and it's physical theater. But there was this fear that if the business was exposed, fans would leave in droves. And, you know, the truth of the matter is the business had been exposed at least since the 1930s, when Jack Pfeffer went to the New York tabloids and gave away some of the business secrets. Roy Shire, after he lost the San Francisco promotion to Vern Gagne, went to the press and, you know, said that, oh, this is staged. Nobody left. Nobody cared.
Now we look at kind of WrestleMania II in the midst of this, and you know, it was an experiment on their behalf, kind of building off of what we had seen with Starrcade as well, the multiple locations, and that's one that comes out. I mean, at that point in 1986, is it a thought of, you know, you just juxtapose 86 to 87, and it's two completely different beasts that you're looking at in terms of WrestleMania? Because I can imagine in 86, maybe Ed Ricciuti is looking pretty spot on with his analysis.
Yes, I mean, and I can remember, you know, attending WrestleMania 2 in '86 at the Nassau Coliseum, and then I don't remember. I had a lot of freelance work back then, and I was taking a plane out to Los Angeles. There was like a 2:30 a.m. flight from. I don't remember. I remember I had to go out to LA after that. But I remember, you know, seeing a lot of empty seats and running into some of the people I knew at Pro Wrestling Illustrated, because, you know, I was friends with these guys and I read Pro Wrestling Illustrated. I wasn't, you know, so tribal that I wouldn't read a rival wrestling magazine. And I liked those guys. I mean, the first time Bill Apter gave me his phone number, I couldn't believe my good fortune, you know, that I had Bill Apter's phone number. That was a very, you know, pivotal moment in my life. And I remember turning to one of the guys from Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and he said, look at this, the scalpers took a bath tonight because there were so many empty seats. And what that conveyed to me was that WrestleMania, you know, in a single arena might be able to draw. But if you're going to do it in 3 separate arenas, maybe there's not the audience for it to go to those live shows. But what Vince was trying to do was he was trying to establish New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. There's no other promotion. Forget about Vern Gagne. Forget about Jim Crockett. Forget about the Von Erichs. Forget about everything that came before. If you're talking about wrestling, it's us and nobody else. That's why he banned the rival magazines from coming to the arenas. It was it was Vince's way or no way. A little bit like, let's say, a world leader who only allows the friendly press to go to press events. Not that I can think of anyone who does.
No comes to mind. Speaking as a Canadian, but what sort of was the dynamic with the wrestling press at this point as we're leading into WrestleMania 3? Like it is very much kind of an inclusive period where WWF. I mean, what was sort of the ways about that the magazines were going about getting their photos and getting access at this time?
Yeah.
Was it?
I mean, look, as you know, that's part of the book, and because again, this isn't just about WrestleMania 3. It's about the other territories. It's about the fans who attended, their experience, and also it's about the wrestling landscape at the time. And wrestling magazines were a key part of promoting the product prior to all the media attention. So, by and large, with the exception of the promotion, I believe in Mobile and Pensacola, there was that promotion, the Gulf Coast Wrestling. They never wanted wrestling magazines there. As a result, people like myself didn't learn about stars like Cowboy Bob Kelly until years later when I read it in Dave Meltzer's newsletter. And Dave Meltzer is in the book because he was playing a role. He was playing the role of, for whatever criticism he receives, of an actual journalist, like analyzing what's really going on behind the scenes, which was unprecedented as well. But prior to Vince's expansion, George Napolitano, Bill Apter, the newsstand wrestling magazines were welcome guests at the WWF shows. And, it was hoped that everyone would work in collaboration and those photos would entice wrestling fans to go to the arenas. Vince McMahon was like, well, why don't I start my own magazine? Then I can completely control the narrative. And I don't need anybody else. I have no say about what these guys will write. If these guys are speculating, maybe I'm going somewhere else with my storylines. And I was writing for the WWF magazine. And sometimes I would be told, I'm going to tell you this, Keith, but you can't tell anybody else. This is where we're going with this, but it's a few months away. So this is why we're going to tease this, but we're not going to blatantly speculate that this person might be turning heel. But that's where it's ultimately going to go.
You have some really great insight into just the whole promotion of WrestleMania 3, from the fact that, some modern fans may not even realize, like, this was basically a 6 to 7 week promotion of tickets going on sale.
It's unreal, right?
Like when you think about today that, the significant percentage of tickets are sold before any match is announced, and it's months in advance that tickets go on sale. Like, this was still at a time where you had to have the right match, the right attraction, and it was a relatively condensed window of this whole promotion where, closed circuits and blackouts are things that modern fans, that they wouldn't even comprehend this being part of the package.
Let me explain what the blackout is.
Yeah.
Because Vince McMahon mandated that every seat at the Pontiac Silverdome be filled, the pay-per-view and closed circuit broadcasts in the Michigan area were blacked out. That meant if you wanted to see WrestleMania 3, you had to physically be there. The closest theater that was showing WrestleMania 3 was in Lorain, Ohio, which is well over 100 miles away from where WrestleMania 3 took place. The other significant thing about WrestleMania 3 was that previously, big wrestling shows were marketed to the region where they took place. So if there was a show in Philadelphia, it was marketed, Philly, the suburbs, New Jersey, maybe part of Maryland. But it wasn't even marketed in New York City. WrestleMania 3 was marketed to the North America. So that meant, again, people were not getting on planes like they do now for WrestleMania by and large, but fans from Canada could drive down. There were fans from Ontario, at least. Fans from Illinois could drive up. Fans from other parts of Michigan or Ohio. They could all converge in this one spot. And when you think of it that way, it does not seem that outrageous that you had a presumed 93,000 fans, because it was marketed everywhere. So the 20,000 you would get in Chicago, maybe you get 5,000 of those. You know, the 15,000 you get in Milwaukee, maybe you get 3,000 of those. But they're coming. Toronto, which was a giant wrestling market, you know, I can't even imagine how many thousands of people drove down from Ontario. So you had a stadium filled with people who did not necessarily live in the Detroit metro area. And that was also unheard of.
And I'm sure that if there had been any, reticence, certainly a feather in their cap was the previous summer. They staged the big event right here in Toronto at Exhibition Stadium. And it's, in excess of 60,000 people for Hogan Orndorff, which is just, it's a locally promoted, bought show here in Toronto. It's a house show. And
it's a house show, and we've seen it before. It's not a unique match. Hogan and Orndorff had gone around before.
And when you look at things, I mean, certainly they were able to put on, as they promoted it as this dream match, which you do go a lot of mythology attached to the promotion of the main event. But this is Hogan coming off like a red hot 86, where you mentioned the Orndorff program drawing well with Kamala and such. But I have to imagine that if it was not Andre in that spot, is there any other main event that could have been put in this venue? Because I think that's so paramount to this whole success.
Hogan and Andre. And, it's similar to the storyline we're seeing now with John Cena as a villain. I guess John Cena might have been booed by certain factions of fans for years, but he hasn't been a villain since 2004. He hasn't been a villain. And when he came in as the prototype, and then the early Cena used to do heel, rap verses.
The rap character,
But we haven't seen that side of John Cena in a very long time. So for a generation of youngish fans, they've grown up as children seeing Cena as a baby face and only a baby face. So John Cena as a heel, calling fans, saying he's in an abusive relationship with the fans, that has people talking, including people who are not wrestling fans, because they know John Cena. They know, but look, I say this in the book. At one point, early on, WWE had to give its promotion credibility by bringing in outside celebrities. Now, The Rock, John Cena, Batista, those are celebrities who came up in the WWE system. They have their own celebrities that they've created. So yes, there's a lot of excitement over Cody Rhodes and John Cena, but it is nowhere near what it was for Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan. I meet people who don't know who Cody Rhodes is. I know people, they know John Cena is because he's a celebrity, but they don't know that he's a villain. When I meet people in the straight world, they're not following it. Everybody in the United States and Canada knew who Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant were. And they also knew the very simple storyline. They were friends, and now they're enemies, and Andre's a bad guy. And that is what grabbed people by the throat and pulled them in.
When we look at some of the figures that you were able to track down, you mentioned Ed Holinsky, and I thought as well, some of the people interviewed here, Basil DeVito Jr. I mean, these are people that are, incredibly influential figures that you very rarely hear from. And that was a personal part of the book that I found so fascinating, tracking down these kinds of individuals where you get a lot of, detail work that would have been lost if not for finding.
Yes, and Basil DeVito was a very key executive in the WWF machine. And he was in sports marketing. He was not a wrestling guy. He was not a wrestling fan. But he understood how the NFL and the NBA did business. And so I remember being surprised when I would see non-wrestling fans backstage. But Vince wanted professionals there. And Basil DeVito ran that office, ran his departments as a professional sports marketer. You know, like there were computers in the office, things that, you know, Vince McMahon at the time said, oh, you know, most wrestling promotions have always been run out of a cigar box and still are. He was right. He wasn't running things like that. And, you know, I would see these suits backstage talking to each other. It's not like they shared anything with me. I wasn't a business guy. I was a wrestling fan who happened to have developed his writing skills enough to be part of this world. But I think I was still regarded as a wrestling fan, a wrestling person, because I remember someone making fun of me because I would reference, oh, this wrestler's father wrestled in this territory. And they're like, who cares, Keith? You know, you weirdo, you strange wrestling fan. Like, where in the sports entertainment business, you're a mark. And I am a mark. I'm still a mark. So I remember really trying to contact Basil, because Basil would never, you know, open up to me. Why would he? And I was shocked when Basil got back to me. He goes, sure, I'll talk about this. And so now I could ask what was going on the business end. And no defensiveness. He was happy to share. And he said of everything else he's done in his life, and he was, I believe, the commissioner of the original XFL.
Yes.
Said nothing compares to WrestleMania.
Well, I would think for a lot of, you know, people in that kind of position, like even at a time when, you know, it was still a very closely guarded industry, that now all these years later, like these are a lot of victory laps for some of these executives to look back. It's like, this was one of their grandest achievements. And I think you get that openness. Now this is not a WWE book. You have written before for WWE, but tell me a bit about any of the changes that you've observed in the process, just by reaching out to people or obtaining photos. Like, how is WWE to deal with when you're tackling a subject like this?
It's certainly more open than it has been in the recent past. In the Paul Levesque era, they are so much more open. I even had this talk the other day on the phone with Bill Apter. And if anyone doesn't know, he's the legendary wrestling photographer who's now close to 80 years old and has been around at least since the early 70s. And, you know, he remembers a time because he was working for, you know, the traditional wrestling magazines where he wasn't even invited to shows anymore. And he says now they just can't do enough for him. And they also respect his legacy as someone who contributed greatly to the business. And, you know, last year I was at WrestleMania 40. And were you there?
I was, yes. We saw each other.
And you remember we were in the press box, and there were, I think, 200 people in the press box, and it was pretty crowded in there.
Very packed.
And it was packed. This year, there were 1,000 media requests. 1,000.
1,000.
So that's wow. Like 5 times more than there were last year, to the point where a lot of people can't get in, and it's no disrespect to them personally. You know, if ESPN wants to get in, and The Guardian and the Daily Mail want to get in, and the Los Angeles Times, you're going to have to leave somebody out. And, you know, I don't think it's like the old days where there's disrespect to the wrestling media, even though some of them are worthy of it, as we know. I think it's that the demand is just so high right now.
Yeah. I mean, I have heard that among, you know, several outlets that has been the situation this year, but I had no idea of like the volume of requests that they're receiving this year. Kind of dovetailing on that. Obviously, when you attach WrestleMania III, and I could sense like you had to tackle the attendance for this show that has almost become a religious debate among those that will go to literally Basil DeVito saying he will go to his grave maintaining the 93-173 number.
Even though he wrote it before the show took place.
It is, and you pointed out so clearly in the book that it's like there are always I think you used it, the titanized numbers that were so clearly for entertainment, but for this reason, this number, and maybe it's a part of fans' childhood, it's like this is like part of their DNA that this has to be the real
Yes.
number. And
I
I
mean,
think
like, people can recite it like they can recite a Bible verse.
like there's no other attendance figure in pro wrestling that has this level of like recall and debate attached to it. And I think for a reporter like a Dave Meltzer, I think there's the frustration that he has seen internal data that listed it as 78,000, and
78,000 sold, but again,
it's finding out the exact number.
Counted everybody in the building, including security guards. And according to Tom Buchanan, who was the photographer,
Yep.
there were people tailgating, and Vince wanted every seat filled, and they opened the doors and said, "Hey, all you tailgaters, get in there. Any empty seat, it's yours." So, they worked really hard to fill the building. The question is, was that building even capable of holding 93,173 human beings? My guess is probably not. But at this point, WWE has been telling this story for so long. I think even now they're laughing about it when they cite that number. It's a little bit like Hulk Hogan, telling the story that him and Andre went to the ring and they didn't know the finish. He'll repeat that. He will never say, "All right, I'm working you a little bit." I think it's a little bit different. The people at WWE know that wasn't the number, but like when I was talking to Basil DeVito and he said, "I'll go to my grave with that number," Basil was having fun. Basil, was not believing this. Or maybe he was. I don't know. I don't know what rests in the mind of Basil DeVito, but we were having a fun, freewheeling conversation, and he was obviously proud of that number.
Well, and kind of lost in this discussion is the fact that they legitimately like sold this out with several weeks to go. And the question becomes, if the building was big enough, what would the demand have been? Like, what was the top point for this show if they could have fit it?
It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's a lot of people. And I was working recently on a non-wrestling project, and one of the people on the TV crew was a camera person who grew up in Detroit, and he pointed out to me that there were only like 2 or 3 roads that led into Pontiac towards the Silverdome, because he said going to Lions games was a nightmare. And so, you hear all these stories about traffic that are in the book, like Aretha Franklin is stuck in traffic. She's supposed to sing America the Beautiful. It was really hard to get there. I mean, people were in their cars and it was gridlocked.
One thing I'd be very curious, because you've been through this process so many times, like you've done individual biographies, but a story like this, that it must be like, obviously for someone like you to dedicate this amount of time to a project, it's fueled by curiosity, learning the facts. And you're speaking to these Ed Helinskis or Tom Buchanan's. It must be really difficult that you could go down these rabbit holes of all these other stories that open up, but you're still trying to keep it to WrestleMania 3. I have to imagine like you're uncovering all these interesting nuggets that you could really take some detours on that are really fascinating.
You can, but look, I've been doing this. I think I wrote my first wrestling article in 1981. So it's not like I'm, like my career is over and I'm not going to have a chance to tell some of these detour stories, in another forum. So it's like everything else. I've heard some stories before. It gets processed back here, and that comes out at another time. But it's a joy to be interviewing these people. And also I am aware that nobody is on this earth forever. I intend to be around a long time, but at some point I'll be gone. I don't think that'll be for a while, but when I'm gone, this book will still be around. And so if in 50 years, somebody wants to know about, the history of WWE making that turning point, they will be able to find this book and they will be able to grasp that history.
When you are looking at the history of the story, was there that one figure or so that has since passed on that you really would have loved to have been able to pick their brain? Was there anyone
Well,
that
not someone who passed on. I mean, it would have been nice to have gotten Vince McMahon to sit down and talk about, his worldview. Obviously, Andre the Giant has passed on. There were certain people I couldn't get to. I got to a lot of people. I used, old interviews I'd done over the years with people who have passed on. But I mean, Vince would have been good. I would have liked to have gone Kevin Dunn, who was the TV executive who oversaw the production. He didn't get back to me.
you
But
did
I
have
got a lot
Nelson
of
Swegler, who was like a real
I got
great
Nelson
insight.
Swegler, who was the vice president of television production, who worked with Kevin Dunn's father. So, and Nelson Swegler, that's a lot of knowledge there. And Nelson Swegler, even though he works as hard as we do, Nelson Swegler's in his 80s. He's still an active TV executive. But, those are stories when I anticipate we're going to still see a lot of Nelson Swegler. I'm not being morbid here, but once Nelson Swegler and Basil DeVito and Mike Weber and all those guys aren't here anymore, those stories go with them. When I wrote Freddie Blassie's book, I guess that came out in 2003, perhaps.
Yep. Yeah.
I interviewed Freddie Blassie. I interviewed John Tolis. I interviewed Killer Kowalski. I interviewed the Fabulous Moolah. I interviewed Arnold Skoland. All those guys are dead. And that means those stories are no longer being told from their perspective. But I got those stories and they live in that book. At one point, no matter how many people are gone, those stories are now enshrined because they are in a bound volume about the history of WrestleMania III.
In all your years, did you ever have a chance to interview or speak with Zane Breslov?
No, I'm sure I met him, but I did not understand what a significant figure he would turn out to be historically.
Yeah, he's a really interesting figure, just in terms of like not just like with WWF, with WCW, but the early days of the UFC as well.
I mean, this is a guy who was basically a local. He was a promoter. Didn't he come from Denver?
From Denver, yes.
And he was originally working for the AWA in Denver, and then jumped ship to Vince McMahon. Clearly, whoever was giving Vince advice at the time knew how valuable Zane Breslov would be. Because was Basil and Zane Breslov, they were really, spearheading the promotion of this event. And, when you talk about the success of WrestleMania III, sure, there's Andre and Hogan, naturally. There's Vince McMahon. But, nobody thinks about Nelson Swegler and Zane Breslov and Basil DeVito. But without those guys, we wouldn't be here now. And so, I'm just so privileged that some of those people spoke to me.
No, I personally, like, I love hearing from these figures, and I'm sure on your bucket list, it's great if you have a Hulk Hogan, but you know what you're getting with a Hulk Hogan when it comes to this, and it's a great name to have, but I mean, you're not really getting the real story from Hulk Hogan.
I tried to get Hulk Hogan too, and then I was on an A&E documentary about. It might have been Andre and Hogan's, maybe the rivalry show, because they had me on their A&E documentaries, and I was on the show. Hulk Hogan was on the show. He's saying, he all but said that it was a shoot between him and Andre. He didn't say that, but he said he didn't know the finish going in. And, I'm like, well, that's what he would have told me. It's not like he would have said, and I've always gone along with Hulk Hogan. And, I may see him WrestleMania week and we'll be very warm to each other. But, he's not going to say, Keith, because we know each other for so long, let me tell you the real story.
You've been very generous with your time here. We'll just wrap up here by looking at March 29th of 1987. It's right there in the title, the year it all changed. if you can go back, like what was the general attitude after WrestleMania 3? Was it the idea that, okay, whatever was planted in 83, 84, 85, by 87, it's like we have a pretty good roadmap of how this industry is going at this point?
Yes, and everybody, I mean, it was exuberant. And interestingly, I watched the show. We didn't have cable TV in my part of Queens, so I actually drove up to the WWE office and watched the show there, and it was an early show.
At their
So
headquarters?
at the headquarters, yeah, because there were
Wow.
people who were not at the event, and they like had a watch party. And I remember being told to kayfabe because there were women who like worked, you know, at the front desk, or maybe they worked in like, you know, mailing out merchandise. And I was told some of these people are believers, so kayfabe a little bit. And
Wow.
so I did kayfabe. And then I remember driving back down to Queens because it was early, and going out on Bell Boulevard to a bunch of bars, and people were just buzzing about watching WrestleMania 3 and, getting into these conversations with people. I remember at one point, like being out on the sidewalk and like showing someone how Hulk Hogan dropped the leg, like jumping up and like dropping my leg on like a tree branch to demonstrate it because I was so wound up.
Wow. That's a fantastic story. Any like notable names that were back in headquarters that didn't get
No,
to go out to the
nobody
show?
important. All the important names were out there in Michigan.
Well, this has been fantastic to chat about. I want to alert everybody that the book is out now through ECW Press. Bigger, Better, Badder. WrestleMania 3 and the Year It All Changed by Keith Elliot Greenberg. And do you want to alert anyone that are going to be in Vegas for
Yeah,
WrestleMania, some of your appearances that you're going to be making?
yes. My dear friends Randy and Susie Tyson have opened a bar, DDT. The name's deliberate. It was previously in Brooklyn. They've moved it to Vegas. It's a wrestling themed bar, although it's also known for its cocktails. And I am going to be signing books there on Thursday, April 17th from 6 to 8 p.m. Pacific time. And it's a great joint. You'll love hanging out there. It's a Thursday night. A lot of people will just be getting in. I'll be signing books. Like I said, Susie Tyson makes great cocktails. You'll enjoy the general vibe. When they had their bar in Brooklyn, there were people who came only for the cocktails and not about the wrestling. Although I remember once, someone coming in and she like said, "Hey, could you turn the wrestling down?" And Randy going, "Ma'am, this is a wrestling bar, so no, you can't turn the wrestling down." But so I will be there 6 to 8 p.m. Then Josh Rice, the puppeteer, who's doing that show Kayfabe, the puppet show at the Vegas Repertory Theater. I will then go from the book signing at DDT to the Vegas Repertory Theater. I will give a short chat. I'll deliver some words about the history of WrestleMania. We're also going to talk about the theme of kayfabe. And then I'll be signing some more books there. Then most likely I will invite everyone at the puppet show back to DDT and do some more hanging out. And there are other events in which I'll take part. Actually, when Busted Open Radio has its pre-WrestleMania party and broadcast, I'll be giving away some free books at that. So yeah, I'll be around, and there's other events that have yet to be announced.
How large would the club be of those that can say they attended WrestleMania 1 and WrestleMania 41?
Um, I would say, because I mean,
Was
that
Bill
is a
Apter at the first one?
he was not,
He was not.
because he was excluded.
You might be
I
in some
believe,
very exclusive company.
yeah. I am not sure how many people will be. Obviously, there are people who have,
Mhm.
because there are people I know who are longtime fans, but I don't know if they'll be at WrestleMania 41. Like a guy like Evan Ginsberg, I don't
Mhm.
know if they'll be in Vegas. So Bill Apter will certainly be a WrestleMania 41. and you'll be there, right?
I will not be actually. I'm back here in Toronto, so yeah, it's I will be home for this year's WrestleMania, but maybe New Orleans next year. I do hope to be out there and get to catch up with you in person, Keith.
Yeah, same here.
All right. Well, everyone, I think you'll learn a lot sitting down and reading this book, hearing from some people that have really never spoken openly about it. I think there might be a book on Ed Holinsky out there. I mean, a real fascinating figure.
He's a great dude. And you know what? I didn't know Ed Holinsky because I worked with Ed Raschuti. It was Steve Taylor, the photographer, who said, "Hey, I got hired in 1983 with Ed Holinsky. I was working for as a photographer for the newspaper. He was a reporter. He's the one who got me in, and I didn't know anything about him. And now, like, he and I talk all the time."
Oh, those are some of the best ones, like just the fountain of information that you uncover. So congratulations, Keith, on the book. Thank you so much for coming on to chat about it. And we wish you all the best with the continued promotion of the book.
And I appreciate you, again, putting me over.